Good afternoon, Gavin Richards, DBS Radio. Earlier on it was mentioned that the ECCB is looking at 5% growth. I just wanted to ask, in terms of so many countries now having to build resilience to climate change, what sort of impact do you think that will have on being able to achieve that 5% growth?
Well, you have a number of issues which, as we indicated this morning, even in our presentations at the opening, which are constraining growth within the Monetary Council. And our susceptibility to external shocks and also natural disasters. I mean, if you take Dominica, for example, the tremendous 90% of our GDP was affected by Erica. And the sheer cost of replacing damaged infrastructure, we've had to divert resources to rebuilding rather than to build. And while you will see some growth as a result of the construction, the booming construction, but that in itself is not even getting anywhere close to the 5% that you expected. We also have the issue of productivity. We have to address the issue of productivity within the workforce endowment in the monetary union. So we have to deal with this issue. The issue of access to funds. You see, the banks have money, but they're not lending to people. So there is an excess liquidity, but it's of no value to anybody except the banks themselves. And you really look at it, there's no real tangible benefit to the banks in that regard. So we have to address a number of issues. Infrastructure. We have to build a more resilient infrastructure. We have to build an infrastructure that can sustain the kind of activities which would usher in the 5% growth that we expect. But we're also constrained by our debt. We have to push towards achieving 60% of debt to GDP by 2030. But government's access to funds is highly limited. And if you borrow, then you increase your debt to GDP ratio. You may have a difficulty in repaying because you're not bringing in sufficient funds into the treasury to be able to sustain that debt. So there's some structural constraints which we have. But I believe if we can address the issue of productivity, if we can cause our countries to be more efficient, if we can deal with the issue of the ease of doing business, we have to look at these reports which the World Bank publishes every year and to really spend time to addressing the ease of doing business, because in our region things take too long to happen, and with delay of execution of certain actions, then we are also impacting our ability to grow. But that notwithstanding, I think with the growth action plan that we have, we'll be looking at, and which will be taken to the various publics, because that growth action plan will need the understanding of all the stakeholders. The unions, for example, there are times the unions will ask for salary increases when the governments cannot even maintain the existing wage bill. You see, there are delays in paying of salaries. The governments have to borrow to pay salaries and so forth. And on top of that, you're asking for a salary increase. And how do you sustain these unsustainable wage bills? And how productive is that labor force? If you invest $140, $200 million in the public service insofar as salaries are concerned, what is the return on that investment? Okay, so we need to get the understanding of the unions. We have to get the understanding of the private sector. We have to get the understanding of the banks and the wider public to understand that if we're to attain a 5% growth in our economy, to increase the opportunities for jobs, to increase economic activity, then there's some actions which we'll have to take, in my respectful view, which may not be necessarily popular, in initial stages, but certainly we have to look at these issues if we're to really achieve the 5% growth. Yeah.
issue of climate change, you would recognize that our respective countries are transitioning into alternate energy, to green energy. I know in the case of Dominica, you were looking at transitioning into geothermal. And certainly in the case of Antigua and Barbuda, we are doing a combination of solar and wind. In fact, by the end of this year, we would have invested $100 million in energy security to transition from fossil fuel to green energy. And the whole idea is to eliminate the volatility in petrol prices. I mean, that in itself is an impediment to growth, and obviously is linked to climate change. So all of our countries are looking at transitioning into green energy as we seek to mitigate against some of the risk of climate change, which are not entirely in our control because we are very small emitters. And as you know, they are major polluters even in this hemisphere, one of which, a country which recently withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. But generally speaking, I think that, as was said by the chairman before, we're seeing an uptick in growth. In the case of Antigua and Barbuda, we did about 6.7%. Governor, I understand that is the revised growth figure for Antigua and Barbuda for 2016. So already, notwithstanding the challenges, we have the capacity to achieve that 5% that we had set sometime before. The issue is about the sustainability of maintaining that 5% minimum growth.
International events such as Brexit and also the healthcare programs in the United States could have some sort of impact on the ECCB. I'm asking, what sort of impact do you think regional events, like for example, what's going on now in Barbados and the fluctuating TT compared to the US dollar in Trinidad and also in Jamaica, what sort of impacts do you think this could possibly have on the ECCB?
Well, certainly as a CARICOM region, whenever any one of our member countries is challenged economically, it tends to have an effect on most of us. For example, in the case of Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago, they are known to be very important source markets for tourism in many of our countries. In other words, quite apart from what tourists we get out of North America and Europe, the Caribbean itself is an important source market for many of our countries. And in that regard, Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago are very important contributors to that. So obviously, if there's less disposable income, if there's depressed economic activity, it's likely to affect the ability of these citizens to be able to travel to the different islands in the ECCU, for example, to take holidays, to spend money, and to do business. As a region, we are always concerned about the extent to which these things can affect our trade arrangement. In the case of Trinidad, again, which is one of the largest economies, the issue of demand from us. They buy a lot of our stuff. We sell a lot of produce, whether it's agriculture, produce, other things. Of course, we buy a lot from them as well. So any economic downturn there can have an effect on demand, which then adversely impacts our own economies. So that's the concern that we have about the situations going on in those countries.